Right, just wait for a couple of seconds. Okay, I think we're live. All right. Cool. I'll get started. So, good day, everyone. Welcome to today's LinkedIn Live session on the topic, the Candidate First Formula, Rethinking Your Hiring Process. I'm Chavi, Content Manager at Recruit CRM, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. I'll mostly be behind the curtains while our expert for the day takes the spotlight. So, today we have with us Raj Kheer. Let me give you a quick introduction about Raj. Raj is a senior talent acquisition partner with a proven track record of building and optimizing recruitment strategies for fast scaling tech companies and enterprises alike. He specializes in improving hiring processes, mentoring teams up to the C suite, and enhancing candidate experience through data driven improvements. Currently at Chapter 2, Raj brings deep expertise in strategic hiring and talent acquisition, helping organizations attract and retain the best talent effectively. So, yeah, with that, we can get started with the session. Raj, do you want to say a quick hi to the audience?
Yeah, no, thank you for your kind words. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Yeah, slightly nervous doing something like this, but I'm kind of grateful to have the opportunity to share some knowledge and hopefully say a few things that would resonate with people in talent acquisition. And yeah, if I can help a few people, then yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. All right, so let's get started. All right, so I'll start by asking you the very first question, Raj. So, why do you think candidate experience is becoming a critical differentiator for recruitment teams today?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think there are kind of two parts to this when I was thinking about it. I would say one is probably more practical, and the other one's probably more around values. So I think on the practical side, putting it simply, people talk. Candidates share their experiences, whether it's good or bad, publicly and kind of privately. So if your hiring process is messy, if it's confusing or even cold, I think that reputation can spread. It can affect referrals, re-engagement, and overall brand perception, especially if you work in a business that's got a kind of consumer side to it. I think people underestimate how much that can really affect kind of your overall kind of brand perception, which is I think a really interesting kind of way to look at it. And I think the other side is really simple when it comes to values. The way I look at it as well, it's like it's just the right thing to do. Um, we're asking people to give their time, energy, and often a lot of emotional labor. Some people are interviewing while working full time or job hunting after redundancy. And for me, like the least we can do is treat them with respect. Candidate experience for me, like it isn't about perfection. It's about making people feel seen and supported during kind of what can be sometimes a very vulnerable moment. And I think when you do that, people remember. For me, times in my career where someone maybe hasn't got the job but has received an experience that they really remembered, like they will talk to you about, they will tell you about that. And they're some of the people that I've got in my career that I remember the most. So I think that's why for me it's really, really critical.
All right, awesome. So, Raj, my next question for you is, what are the most common pain points candidates face during the hiring process that recruiters often tend to overlook?
Yeah, there are a few that kind of come to mind when I was kind of thinking about this. I think the first one, and probably the biggest one, is silence. I think it's kind of being left in the dark, which is I kind of think is probably one of the worst parts of job hunting. Um, I think often that silence is because there's no news, but I think even if that is the case, some sort of update still helps. Like no one likes it when um, they're not being kind of given an update. I think that kind of builds up with anxiety in terms of candidates, and yeah, it's not really a nice place to be. I think secondly, it's like lack of clarity. Candidates should know what to expect, who they're meeting. They should know what all the stages are as early as possible, if not at the very, very first call. They should understand kind of what's being assessed. They shouldn't really have to guess, and I think that clarity can make a really big difference. I think then you've got interviews. I think sometimes they can be quite cold, quite overly rigid, especially where like it's all just questions, a Q&A, and you don't really have that sort of conversation. I think it puts people on edge and you don't really get to see them at their best. And then finally, it can be when processes drag on. It could be endless steps, it could be kind of added steps throughout the process, unclear timelines, delays. And I think that itself kind of wears people down. But I think what's really interesting, like I say, is what people often overlook. I don't think any of this is often very intentional. I think as recruiters, we're very busy. We're often juggling multiple roles, multiple plates. So often when it comes to silence, people could be there chasing feedback and waiting for something to come back before they speak to a candidate. But the candidate doesn't see any of that. They only hear silence or don't see anything. So often it's kind of taking a step back and it's kind of seeing things from the candidate's perspective, and so imagining you were at one point a job hunter in your kind of lifetime. So I think it's looking at it from that perspective is I think where you can kind of overcome a lot of those. I kind of will go on about it a lot, but for me, when it comes to candidate experience, the simplest thing you can do is the communication side and bringing that up.
All right, I love that. So, Raj, I have another question for you. How can recruiters redesign their workflows to prioritize candidate experience without slowing down time to hire?
Yeah, I think like you don't really, in my eyes, you don't need to slow down to give like a really great experience. In fact, I've found that when you've got a process that's clearer, um, more more kind of candidate first, they often move faster. If that makes sense. But I think it comes with preparation. So I think it starts with mapping out the journey. Knowing kind of each stage what's going to happen, and I think if you've got past data points to kind of go by, like where are common friction points, where do things tend to stall, but then also really understanding when it comes to the interviews, like who owns each stage, what are we assessing for at each stage. I find constantly kind of tracking what's going on, as well as tracking conversion rates between each stage can really help spot any bottlenecks. I think that's kind of one really good way to start is having that data there to understand kind of where things could be kind of slowing down, and kind of how we can improve that. I think when you're kind of focusing a bit more on the kind of communication side of it, sorry, one thing that's worked well is kind of setting SLAs in terms of internal feedback and comms. So that could be getting interview feedback, it could be getting feedback from a CV, but having that internally and agreed with the hiring teams is really important. Using templates for scorecards can really help with kind of speeding up admin without losing that human touch. But also when it comes to communication with candidates, having in certain aspects those sort of kind of templates can be really key. And also I think being clear on what can be automated and what needs kind of human connection, if that's kind of laid out at the very beginning of a process, I think that makes a big difference. But also I think with all of this, it's about getting buy-in from your hiring managers. Often when things go sour, or when processes get delayed, it often comes down to misalignment. So I think when everyone's aligned, I think getting that alignment as early as possible and have that preparation done as early as possible, I think candidates genuinely feel it. I think it comes across that you know what you're talking about, you know what you're doing, and I think that confidence that you can then show to a candidate kind of rubs off. But I think that in itself then makes everything run more efficiently. I think things run a lot more like clockwork. I think again, like what I've said, it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. A lot of this stuff, you don't need all the bells and whistles and all that kind of thing. Ultimately, for me, communication is really key. I think if something's well designed, from what kind of I've said, and the communication is there, then for me that prioritizes candidate experience, and that's kind of the most important thing.
All right, Raj, you mentioned automation. So, my next question is along those lines. So, what role do you think technology plays in enhancing candidate experience, and are there any specific tools or features you recommend?
Yeah, tech definitely helps, especially when it comes to consistency and speed. So like you can start off with like scheduling. I don't know if I'm allowed to advertise any particular tools, but there's kind of a lot of good ones out there, and um, allowing candidates to like self book. If you can get tools that kind of feed into your calendars and your interviewers calendars, and they can then just pick a slot. I think that's where you can kind of do away with the human touch to an extent, where it just makes it more normal easy. I think where you could add in self-service for candidates, it kind of feeds into this whole kind of candidate/consumer sort of market, where they can just pick up a phone, open up an email, go into a link, and select a slot for an interview that works for them. I think that's one technology I think is really good, and it's coming along really well in the last kind of couple of years. Also, kind of different ATSs can automate updates. If you put someone through to a certain stage, they can get an automated email to get them to book in an interview, but also kind of keeping track of where kind of candidates are in the process. I think simple things that you could probably get within ATSs, like post-interview surveys, feedback forms, that can give you that kind of insight, I think is really important. And then one thing that I've kind of found that works really well is interview note taking. often for me, when I'm in an interview and I didn't have this technology, you're typing, you're potentially missing things the candidate is saying. The interview itself maybe sometimes doesn't flow. That might just be me, but I found using AI interview note taking, you can focus a lot more on the conversation. It's helped me to listen better, probe better with questions, and then at the end of the call, you've got all this data from the call. You can even kind of delve deeper into that, but essentially allows you to kind of increase that real connection. What I found, and I think that's what for me is really key, is when technology, it kind of supports that connection. It's not there as a tick box exercise. It's not there to replace what we do in terms of kind of being that human. It's I think yeah, it's when it can save us time on admin tasks and things that could be self-service, and then gives us more time for things that matter, things like prepping candidates, giving feedback, and keeping that communication human. So I think we definitely need to lean into tech. We need to lean into AI. I think that's really key. But one thing we shouldn't do is hide behind it. I think they can really complement each other to make the overall experience, a lot better for candidates.
Yeah, all right. I completely agree. Okay, I have another question. So, how can recruiters leverage data and feedback from candidates to continuously improve the hiring journey and the hiring process?
I think firstly, the first step is like ask, whether you're asking on a call or whether you're sending out kind of feedback surveys. I think that's definitely a first port of call. Sometimes people don't even have the data, so where do you actually begin? And then it's about actually listening and taking actions. Ultimately, you don't need fancy tools for this. Like I said before, like a lot of ATSs now will have something inbuilt where you can create an easy candidate survey. I think also what's really key in that situation is sending it out to every candidate. If any candidate has some sort of interaction with you, maybe gone through that first interview, maybe not passed, ask everyone at that point onwards how they felt about the process, what was good, what wasn't so good, and don't just give it to candidates who you ultimately are going to hire or get to that end of the process, because you may get a lot more skewed information. And also, I think when the other side of it, when people have those kind of candidate surveys, they also maybe skirt the opportunity to ask like in person on calls. I think if you ever get candidates to kind of a final stage before they get hired or not, I think that's a great time to ask, because they've been through that entire process with you. So I think in that sense, even on the call with them, maybe a debrief call, just ask them genuinely, like, how do they find it, what went well, what didn't go so well, and be open to kind of whatever feedback they may get. And I think that's where you can also get a lot of really good insight. But then I think also it's about pairing that with the general data. So like, look for patterns also within what you're being told with this feedback. Like, are candidates consistently confused about the process? Are they dropping out at the same stage? So look at that stuff to see kind of are there any patterns, but then also marry that up with your own internal data. So what's your time to feedback? What are your conversion rates and drop-off points? I think having that overall picture really tells you kind of a true picture and a true story. And then when you combine the feedback from candidates with the data that you've got, I think that's when you get, like I said, the full idea and picture of what needs adjusting. I think that's when I think you can make better decisions about really creating a process that's going to be very, very focused on candidate experience. And then again, like, you don't need to overhaul stuff. Like, it can be often very small, manageable changes, but I think making those small iterative changes regularly can make a really big difference.
All right, I love that. So, Raj, in your experience, what mindset shifts do recruitment teams need to make to move from a transactional hiring to a candidate first approach?
So, like, one thing I would say is, like, most recruiters, I think we all care about candidate experience. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think anyone, especially in talent acquisition, goes into this role and doesn't care about what the candidate experiencing. So, um, I would say kind of potentially it's like a broader mindset shift across the hiring team, where it's not just about we're fitting a role, but we're kind of guiding someone through like a really big life decision and kind of maybe seeing kind of that side of it. So it kind of comes down to what I've been saying before about giving candidates clarity, timely feedback, a sense of being valued, and also kind of that sense of like respect. But then not just doing that when they've been hired or if they've been hired, but doing that every stage. And then also I think like it's about consistency. So it's not just about treating the top candidates well; it's about treating everyone well. And I think when it comes to like the mindset shift, sorry, it's I think often, like I said, everyone's really busy. You're juggling different roles. It gets kind of you can get really bogged down in that kind of sort of situation. But then it's often kind of taking a step back, putting yourself in the candidate's shoes, and kind of seeing how you would feel in that situation, and kind of looking at how can we make this slightly better. I often talked about things in the past where, like, go through your own application process and see how that is. If it's too long, if it's asking for extra steps, like how would you as a candidate feel about completing that? So I think they're the sort of shifts I think that can make a big difference. Another thing is it's not about like this is like an extra that we do to like make us feel good. Like is what helps kind of I think what helps you stand out. And I think you don't need to make really big changes to stand out in this market. I think you read it online, a lot of kind of bad experiences, I think, is the ones because it's, to be fair and sadly it's still a bit of a minority that people get amazing candidate experience, so you can really stand out and I think really build trust, and then in the long term you're going to kind of attract really good people because they understand and they know what your business is about when it comes to candidate experience.
All right, awesome. I just have one final question for you before we transition into the Q&A round. So could
Mm.
you share like a real world example where improving candidate experience led to better quality hires or a stronger employer brand? Maybe something from your own experience?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking about this before, and so one area, like I said, for me, like the big thing is kind of always about communication and what we're doing to make sure candidates are never kind of left out of the loop or out in the lurch. And one simple thing that we did at a previous company that I worked at was setting really clear internal SLAs for communication. So this is talking about communication with candidates. So at every touch point that a candidate had, we made sure that within 2 working days, they had some sort of response, some sort of an update. But then also what we then said was at every stage, again, there was an SLA that after every 40 hours, they would have some sort of an update. So if, for example, it took you a bit longer to get feedback from a manager, you would still go back to that candidate within a couple of days and give them a kind of very open, transparent update. I then kind of take it from there. I think that's quite a key thing for me. Like even if it's a case of saying like we're still aligning or we're still maybe interviewing other people to make sure we got the right kind of all the picture before we can make a decision. I think as long as they've heard something. So then again, looking at it from the other side of it, a candidate who's had an interview, they've not heard anything for 4 or 5 days, to their eyes, loads of thoughts could go through their head. It may just be a case of you haven't got feedback that soon, but I think that was a really key thing. So then we made everyone accountable in the TA team, but also that kind of fed along to hiring managers giving us feedback in time. But as a TA, we held ourselves accountable to make sure we went back to the candidate with some feedback. I think another thing that was really useful, which is more kind of internal in terms of our processes, well, we started to do debrief calls for every final stage candidate. So once final had been completed, within 24 hours, we would invite every interviewer who was in that process. And essentially, it was sometimes as short as 15-20 minutes, where every interviewer very quickly went through their feedback and whether they kind of thought based on the feedback, whether this person was a hire or not, and what level potentially they were. That was great because we got all the feedback in one meeting. The kind of decision making, the hiring lead was in that call as well, gave his feedback after the final, and we ended that call knowing what we were doing in terms of hiring for that candidate, but also more importantly, we had a really kind of detailed but succinct feedback. So in both cases we would do it, but especially if a candidate got rejected, we were able to then go back to them and give them really detailed feedback as to why they weren't hired. That would always be on a phone call as well. I'm a definite believer that if a candidate has spoken to someone in a process, then we should be speaking to them, especially at a final stage. No one likes getting to that point and receiving a really short email saying, "Oh, you were great, but we're going with someone else." So I think that for me were 2 really key things that I think really made a difference to candidate experience. And I often say it like it's the candidates who don't get the jobs but give you amazing feedback is like the ones that really stick with me. So I think that was really good. I think I've had people in the past who were referred from candidates who maybe didn't get a job previously, and also ones who came back again for other roles if the feedback kind of fitted. It was something that we kind of looked at as well. And yeah, I think also kind of the ones that we did hire as well, they came in more confident. They really understood kind of what went well for them. They kind of we set them up, I think, for success in the future as well. And I think they already felt like really respected, really supported. But then also they had a really good, clear picture of what the culture of the company was like based off the fact of like the process they just received. And I think that's kind of really underrated about how important that is. And I think, yeah, ultimately kind of it was for me, like it wasn't about extra time or the cost behind it. It was about making sure like no one felt forgotten really. So yeah, they were two, initiatives that we did, I think made a kind of real impact. And to be fair, very, very easy to implement.
All right, awesome. I think those are all the questions I had for you. We can now start taking questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Raj, for answering all of my questions so well.
No,
But
no.
yeah, we're now transitioning into a Q&A. We have like a short 5 to 10 minute long Q&A. So if anybody has any questions in the audience, they can just drop those questions in the chat on either LinkedIn or YouTube. So we actually have one question from one of the attendees already. They're asking, what are the biggest reasons of candidate drop-offs according to you?
So I think I think especially now in the market, like there are a lot of really, really good candidates who are on the job market, as sad as that is, with redundancies that are going on globally. So you're often competing with other processes. So what I found a lot of the time is candidates who are in other processes that are working better, more smooth, and they're getting through that process a lot quicker. I think they're the ones that I find. It's often a case of I've received another offer. I've kind of gone with another business, and that's why I'm kind of dropping out. I think that's probably the biggest one for me. I think is for other companies to understand that they're not the only ones that these candidates are interviewing with, and if you don't move quick enough in a market full of really strong candidates, you're gonna often lose them if you don't have an efficient process.
All right, all right. Let me see if we have any other questions. We do have, we have one more question. They're asking, what are some metrics or feedback mechanisms that we should monitor to improve the candidate experience continuously?
So I think if you're talking internally, I think there's a couple of things. So I think one is around, one thing I like to track for myself personally, but also try to track with the team, is around conversion rates. It doesn't always tell. I think you have to go into each stage and really work out why it was happening. But if you see, for example, there's a lot of candidates dropping out at a pair programming stage or a product stage, that can tell you one kind of idea. But then it's also understanding why that might be. It could be the interview itself is proving too difficult, and is there reasons behind that, or is it a case of they're in that stage for way too long, so they're often dropping out because they've received another opportunity. I think it's good to look at things like time to hire, but I think for me that's too big of a metric. I think you want to break that down to different kind of areas, and then when you see problems, kind of really being able to delve kind of deeper into that. If you can marry that up with kind of candidate surveys and see if there are any patterns in what people are saying, I think for me they're probably the kind of the two things that I always find as a go-to. Helps a lot with kind of tracking kind of how the candidates are experiencing the process.
All right, awesome. I think we have, let me see if there are any more questions. Yeah, we have one more. So how do you recommend recruiters balance the need for a fast hiring process with creating a thoughtful and personalized candidate experience?
Sorry, Shelby, you cut out a bit there. I didn't quite catch
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I think it must be echoing. Yeah, so we have another question. They're asking, how do you recommend recruiters balance the need for a fast hiring process with creating a thoughtful, personalized candidate experience?
Um, so the way I look at it is like a lot of the work kind of starts at the very, very beginning. So like it doesn't need to be like a balancing act, so to speak. So like I think being very clear at the very beginning of the process in terms of who's kind of what we're assessing at each stage. Also, like what are we essentially assessing for? Like how are you aligned with the managers? Because I think a lot of the time you might be doing a lot of screening calls, think you're kind of finding the right candidate, but then a lot of them they're maybe failing that first stage or not passing a CV review. So I think that's kind of quite a big thing initially, which I think set you up to create a really great process. But also I think it's about being kind of intentional with your time. It's a simple thing in terms of like diary management. Having kind of where I've kind of been taught and trained from my careers, or having blocked in your day to do like specific tasks which are really important in terms of the overall process. That could be you having a block every day or every other day for like sourcing and for like outreach messaging, time in there where you're kind of having a screening call to speaking to candidates, but then also having space in your diary where you can effectively kind of manage your pipeline, so to speak, so like some of the admin work that's needed. I think that's quite key. And another thing which is something that's always been a kind of a big thing for me is called it kind of like feedback Fridays. So like every Friday, I would go through my pipeline, and if there's any candidates that are still waiting for feedback, I would essentially spend like half an hour to an hour just going for every candidate and sending him a brief email, a brief note. And this could be a templated thing as well, where you're just sending a kind of an email out, essentially saying you're not forgotten about, you're still in the process. Bear with us a bit longer and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. I think just getting that email, especially doing it kind of before the weekend, so they're not kind of dwelling on it over the weekend, I think is something that's I think always been appreciated from when I've got feedback from candidates. But I think that's kind of for me really key. And like the other thing around it is like you having a regular sync with the hiring managers. So I think always rechecking on alignment and in terms of kind of where you're at, because as we all know as recruiters, like priorities can change, job descriptions can change, and the last thing you want is to be kind of taken by surprise by something. But then ultimately, as long as you're transparent with candidates throughout, it can often kind of be mitigated in a positive way. So yeah, I'm not saying it's easy. Of course, it's not easy, and like you're competing with some of the other companies. But I think putting in the work at the very beginning to really create that alignment across the hiring team, and then doing those little things throughout the process. I think that can help still make it efficient, but equally give a really good candidate experience.
All right, thank you, Raj. We have one more question now. This could be like interpreted from like the candidate's perspective or maybe from the recruiter's perspective. But they're asking, in the competitive job market, what stands out for the candidates? And then they've mentioned stands out for them to choose us among others. Like this could be from the recruiter's perspective, like a company's perspective, or a candidate's perspective as well. Like, uh, how you best interpret this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, like in terms of when I've kind of got feedback from candidates in the past, I think what makes you stand out is like the level of communication and care. Because I think the way you've got to look at it is, as recruiters, where often the first impression people have, I mean, obviously they'll have the website, they'll have the application, but once they speak to someone in the company, we're often the first person they'll speak to. So I think how we interact with them throughout the process, I think makes a big difference in terms of standing out, because I think you're then an extension of the culture of the business you're recruiting for. So doing extra in terms of interview prep, interview debriefs. I've spoken with the candidates in the past who have literally never had that. I think different countries, it can be different as well in terms of expectations. But for me, that's what really stands out. But then that kind of extends to the interviews itself, which obviously as recruiters, we don't have a massive control over while it's happening. But I think having interviewers trained properly, where it's not just a Q&A, they're able to kind of, again, showcase the culture of the business. I think if as a candidate you go through a process that's really efficient, really clear, kind of, and just runs really smoothly, for me that gives a really good impression of what working at the company is going to be like. Whereas conversely, if you have a process where like everything's slow, everything's clunky, things always change, candidates will maybe start to think, is that how it's going to be if I'm to join? Are things going to constantly be changing? No one's going to know what's going on. So it's thinking of the hiring process as like an extension of what it's like to work for that company, and almost giving them a peek behind the curtain as to what it's like. I think that's for me what really stands out.
All right, awesome. I think those are all the questions that we have. Let me quickly see if we have anything else. Nope, I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, that was it for the session today. Raj, do you have any closing remarks before we wrap up, before we end the live?
No, I mean, firstly, obviously, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. I think the only thing I would say is that like so much of this I think comes from just like simple human things like clear communication, thoughtful structure, treating people with respect. I think we're all moving like really fast to like find the best people and kind of do what we think is right. But for me, like just slowing down just enough to like design a better candidate experience. I think it doesn't just help people, but I think it will help your kind of hiring outcomes as well. Um, so yeah, I think for me, communication is the biggest thing. I think if you're going to start anywhere, just look at how you're communicating with candidates, how often, and what kind of comms. And I think that's always a great starting point. But yeah, thank you so much again, and I appreciate everyone for who has come in to listen. Yeah, I'm kind of keen to keep this conversation going. So always happy if people want to connect and have a kind of just an informal chat with me about this sort of stuff. Yeah, I love talking about anything candidate experience.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Raj. That was wonderful. And yes, like Raj mentioned, do connect with him on LinkedIn, follow him for like more information, for more tips, and for more advice. And also check out his website. The company that he works at, Chapter Two. We're dropping all of these links in the comments right now. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about Recruit CRM, we have a website. You can check that out as well. And in case you want to check out the product live, you can book a demo or even sign up for our no commitment free trial. And you can follow us on our different social media platforms to stay up to date with all the upcoming LinkedIn lives that we might have. We might even do a part 2 with Raj sometime soon. So yeah, you can follow us for the latest updates. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, Raj. It was lovely having you, and thank you the audience members for asking those interesting questions.